Okay, here we are in part two, and looking at gray power in the sunset years. We're looking at the elderly. Now, we just looked like in part one, we looked at what are some of the dimensions of aging, and we also looked at what happens in regards to some of the lifestyle issues and family relationships. Now, what we're going to move into now is we'll start looking into how does illness and death affect families. Now, of course, that's going to affect every family. And it happens at different points in an old person's lives, and some of it's much more earlier and others it's later, but also some of it is regard to illnesses, but death is inevitable. And so we're going to look at how families deal with that, and how do different culture groups deal with aging and illness and death. And then lastly, what we'll touch base on will be the social policies. Now, social policies come out of the governmental laws and guidelines about how to care for, including healthcare issues, and how do these things affect families and older members. And that's what we're going to do in part two. So once we complete this, we'll be finished through week 8, I guess. So we're moving right along. So keep up the good work and have fun. Thank you. Okay, when we think in terms of death of a family member, there's varying ways that we can enter into this discussion. We're going to start with terminal illnesses. Now, terminal illness can be very stressful for families, as you can likely imagine. Both the dying person and his or her relatives must face a deterioration of physical and mental powers. The family has to prepare for the actual death and for the change that occurs in lifestyle and relationships. And it can be quite significant. You know, you have grandchildren, so your own children as well as the senior, and that relationship, your own relationship with your parents, it becomes quite a stressful and very dynamic period of time. A lack of openness may affect the ability to talk about matters such as prolonging life once the quality of life is destroyed. And in Canada, Quebec has already begun this important talk about end-of-life rights. And what can people do regarding the end of their own life, or do they get prolonged deaths as a result of being in hospitals and long care facilities? And so being able to talk about these issues become very important. Funerals are family times when all relatives gather together, and until a funeral is over, family members often forget the differences and often assist one another at that period of time of loss. Now, death of a family member can include all sorts of dynamics, but widowhood initially involves a sense of loss, disorientation, and loneliness, especially if it's an acute illness as opposed to something that's drawn on. And acute usually is something kind of quick. True for cohabitating as well as same-sex couples, this sort of sense of loss and disorientation and loneliness. You miss that person, and you've gone through, whether it's your spouse or whether it's a parent, this has been a difficult time. Women who have centered their lives on their husbands and family often feel a loss of identity and status. For some, however, the death comes as a relief. Examples when one partner has suffered a long time or the relationship has been unhappy or abusive, women tend to manage better than men after the death of a spouse. In a lot of cases, women have been supportive of their husbands, where husbands haven't really necessarily maintained or looked after themselves as much, making meals, doing laundry, and things like that. When if their spouse dies, then men sometimes find that difficult to pick up those skills. In the first year following a death of a spouse, men more than women suffer an increase in death or suicide rates. Often death of a spouse means a drop in family income, especially when the employed partner dies, and this is experienced more likely by women. Long-term hardships tend to be greater for women, since often they have limited financial resources, for example pensions, and are less likely to find a new partner. Now that has started to change in recent years as well. So when we think about the close, the couple relationship, a majority of older people live with a family member, usually a spouse. An increasing number of older women are divorced, and sexual relationships remain important in old age. Men are more likely to remarry following death of or a divorce from a spouse. More eligible women than men because men tend to die earlier. Adult children may actively discourage remarriage because they see it as a disloyalty to the deceased parent or because they are worried about their inheritance. The couple relationship, because people as they get older continue to search out this coupleton, it really seems to promote or support the norm in our society of how important a relationship is. And a couple relationship is an important family dynamic and family relationship in Canadian society. When we carry this on through to the relationship with siblings, most young old people have at least one living sibling. Quality of sibling relationships does not usually undergo dramatic changes as people age. Siblings' experience of growing up in the same family often draw them together. Illness and death of a parent may influence the siblings' relationship, while retirement and the empty nest, siblings often increase contact. Sisters are closest, followed by brother-sister pairs. Those who have never married and the childless widow depend most on siblings. So siblings, you don't choose your family, and they are probably the one most enduring relationship that you'll have in your life. Now, if we carry on to relationship with children, most older people have at least one child with whom they are in touch. Closest relationships usually is between mother and daughters. Married children are not as close to parents as divorced or separated, and especially the never married. Childless couples may have active social networks that take the place of children. They may have a lot of other people in their lives that may not be their blood relations, but they keep in connection with a lot of people. When a partner is absent or unable to provide help, children often provide support. However, the parent-child relationship is not one-sided. When adult children have crises such as divorce or widowhood or birth of a child with health problems, parents are key providers of support. And so these relationships continue on and take on different dynamics as we get older. If we look at the relationship with grandchildren, as a population ages, increasingly common for several generations to know each other. The relationship between grandparents and grandchildren is considered special because it's not complicated by parental responsibilities. Grandchildren tend to be close to grandparents with whom their parents have a good relationship. Grandparents can be a positive effect on their grandchildren. Grandparents are particularly important to young adult generation who regard them as important sources of emotional gratification and conveyors of family histories and traditions. Grandfathers tend to have less contact with grandchildren compared to grandmothers. Divorce has an impact on grandparents, and the number of step-grandparents is growing. Many grandparents provide care for their grandchildren. Grandparents, especially grandmothers, are an important child care resource for working parents, either for the whole day or the day before or after school. 1 in 5 children receive such care. Grandparents face several challenges when they take over child care. They may lack the energy to do so, and grandchildren may have suffered from family breakup and have emotional baggage. They're often not recognized as legal guardians. Now, when we think in terms of other groups, minority groups, and aging, we look at immigrants. And cultures differ greatly in the view regarding how responsible middle generations should be to the elderly. Certain ethnic groups have strong beliefs about not abandoning relatives into nursing homes. Other people may feel isolated and ashamed both because they are away from family and community and because elders are traditionally cared for within the family. Nursing homes designed for specific ethnic groups help reduce the feeling of being cut off from one's culture. Recently, immigrants are more likely to live in 3-generational households than those born in Canada, especially if from Asia or Latin America. Elderly immigrants living and aging in Canada face many challenges. They could include language barriers, the disappearance of traditional social networks, the inability to access economic resources. When they join children in Canada, elders leave behind familiar attitudes towards seniors and customary ways of life. Children may have adopted mainstream cultural norms, and older immigrants may thus feel further displaced. And so it can be much more of a challenge in some regards. Now, when we think in terms of Aboriginal people, currently Aboriginal children under the age of 6 are more likely to be living with grandparents than in non-Aboriginal children. Traditionally, the grandparent generation among Aboriginal people was responsible for socializing children, and in return, grandchildren had the honored responsibility of helping grandparents remain independent. The elder role is eroding through the coming of Christian missions and accompanying residential schools, which remove children from their homes and cultures. During the 60s and the 70s, many children apprehended by child and welfare authorities and placed in non-Aboriginal foster and adoptive families. Now the role of family is being taken on by community through services such as home support for the elderly and on-reserve nursing homes. Recent renewal of the interest in traditional Aboriginal ways is emerging. Elders once again are valued as custodians and transmitters of cultural traditions. In 2001, the survey found that about half of Aboriginal children living off reserves who could now understand or speak an Aboriginal language had learned it from a grandparent. Thank you, everybody. That is the end of Grey Power and the Sunset Years, Chapter 8. I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck on the rest of the semester, and look forward to seeing you next week. Bye now.